everyone. Welcome back to the Ludiverse. I'm Jay, and I have my friend here to talk to us today. Care to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Hunter. I am the uh, the host and DM of another podcast Jay is on, A Sundered World, a live play D&D podcast. I'm a published author. I got short stories and a novel through HCS Publishing, and basically here to talk about something that has been viewed as a joke in the role-playing community for a while, but honestly, it's perfect for Jay's podcast and what the subject matter that he covers here.
Yeah, and that would be?
That is, of course, the Book of Erotic Fantasy, which I just probably triggered a bunch of old grognards as soon as I brought that up. But honestly, there's a lot in reading through it. Whoever wrote this, for a book that's 20 years old, is remarkably progressive, and honestly, they knew what they were going for.
I managed to get a copy of it, and didn't really get a lot of time to look through it, but the fact that they go into magical STDs means to me that they really wanted to add, the realism of, the whole sex thing into this fantasy world, which, fun and all, but not something you'd see in a lot of games.
And they actually handle that in the introduction to the book. They literally have a section. It's close to half a page of them talking about how to handle sex in a mature way. And they talk about how people will normally deflect into humor when talking about sex because our society is so repressive and it's an uncomfortable subject for most people. So by turning it into humor, it allows us to more comfortably talk about what's going on. And they say that that's perfectly fine if that's what's most comfortable for your game. But they also talk about how, look, if you want to approach this from a serious perspective, here are some ways to do it. And, you got to be open about, and they basically, lay it out like a session zero, as well as, the beginnings of any kind of dom-sub relationship or anything like that. You got to lay out, okay, where are your limits? Are these comfort zones, is there a hard limit to this? Is there a soft limit? Does it depend on your mood, or are there certain things that are just strictly off the table? And as long as everybody is in agreement with that, then you go and treat it as if it's just part of the world, part of the game, and there you go. Which is freaking amazing because, they're literally using language that I never came across in my own life. Yeah, I'm pretty damn vanilla, but I never even saw this kind of language used to talk about it until at least 10 years after I first knew about this book. So this is something that clearly was written by people in the kink and fetish community that knew what they were talking about, knew what they were going for, and were trying to kind of put it, I guess by putting it in a game that was already considered not real and something that was used for fantasies and exploring different things, that it was a safe space to introduce people to this sort of stuff. And I find that really freaking awesome.
Oh, definitely. It's there are a lot of people who I've seen or I've heard where they'll play the games and they prefer to do the fade to black on the sex scenes if they have them at all. But having this as a resource, definitely for those who are a little more open and accepting of human sexuality, or humanoid sexuality in this case, it's good to have a resource to fall back on so you're not just fumbling in the dark and making stuff up. It seems it's a pretty, it's not a huge book, but it's a pretty big book for something that would be used for such a niche situations, because it's not something that would come up in every campaign.
And it's pretty comprehensive. I haven't had time to really delve into it. I spent the last couple days really poring over the at least the first section of the book, or the first chapter of the book, because it delves into like culture surrounding sexual or the view of sex and everything surrounding it. It treats the races in D&D as different species, which again that like boggled my mind, because that was something that from my position in the TTRPG community, like that was something that wasn't really part of the conversation until like the past 4 or 5 years. When they start bringing up like, are they really, if they're races, then they should be able to interbreed freely. Whereas if they're species, then that would explain why, okay, you can only have, like, elves can only reproduce outside the elf kind with humans, and why you never see half dwarves and things like that. And they actually treat things in terms of genetics and compatibility and things like that. They literally and like, yes, they do. The section on player character races is titled player character races, and they will occasionally use the word race. But when they're talking about sexual compatibility, whether one particular type of character can get another particular type of character pregnant, they break it down into species. They also break down things like, if a character does get pregnant, this is what they kind of extrapolate, like the length of the pregnancy and what it's most likely like for that particular entity, and how like certain societies probably view sex and all this stuff. And this, they literally made it as comprehensive as possible to it basically say, like, if you're going to put sex in your game, this is how to make it part of the world. Like, they laid out a superstructure for anyone to kind of build around and put it in their games, just like that, no questions asked. And it's amazing. They talk about how certain things are taboo in sex. They talk about how these are taboos that are strictly cultural, like a taboo against homosexuality, or relationships outside of certain social castes. Like, those are all completely dependent upon culture. And then they also talk about these are certain taboos that are universal, like incest between close relatives, like brother, sister, father, daughter, etc. Bestiality, necrophilia, pedophilia, those things are, like, every culture considers them taboo, regardless of whether a culture is quote unquote good or evil. Like, those things are completely off the table. They go in about how, like, if you want to view the people who are hardliners in the tabletop game community about alignment systems, like, okay, if you're going to be hardline about alignment systems, here's how each alignment would theoretically view sex. Like, a lawful good person is always going to make sure that their partner is consenting to whatever they do. Everything, they want to make sure that their partner is satisfied before they are satisfied. Whereas, a lawful neutral character is kind of like, well, sex is more of however the society views it. So it's like, okay, if I'm not supposed to have sex outside of any kind of procreative purpose, then I'm not going to have sex unless I'm trying to have a kid. So it really, like, they go all in and all out when it comes to making this as easily understandable and as broadly defined while still giving people specific information that they need. And, like, it's a shame that this book is A, out of print, and B, costs so goddamn much for physical copies now, because the it's so rare that now you're looking at $300-400 to buy a physical copy. I mean, because this is something that, like, the tabletop community is definitely ready for. They weren't ready for in the late 90s, early 2000s when this book came out, but they are ready for it now, and it needs to be spread out there, because this is stuff that it just, frankly, like, that's why it's perfect for this podcast, because it's giving people information in a way that is easily digestible to them, and it's making it normal.
Yeah, I agree. Like, Well, like I said earlier, like I managed to get a copy. I have a PDF copy. I think I got mine the same way you did.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I'd be more than happy to share that with anybody that would be interested because it's good information, and I mean, some of it even would be good information for the real world outside of the game. And it, $300-400 is an awful lot of money to pay for something that's really not even usable because it would have to be adapted for unless you're playing an older version of D&D.
That's the big thing. Like, technically, because it's like third edition D&D, it can be easily converted to be compatible with like Pathfinder first edition, but you would have to do some significant changes for it outside of anything else. What I do like about it, though, as far as the game mechanics, is that they really talk about, okay, if sex is part of your game, this is how you handle it. Like, sex is a performance. How well you're able to please the other person depends on how well you are able to perform. They actually use the perform skill in the mechanics. That's how you do in bed. Except that what they also do is they introduce a seventh ability score called Appearance. And Appearance, in most situations, can be used interchangeably with Charisma because, yeah, in a lot of ways, looks count for a lot in sexual attraction. But then also, Charisma becomes force of personality. Yeah, somebody may not have the best looks, but if they know how to talk to somebody and they know how to really get into, to really stimulate your mind, then, yeah, the looks don't matter that much. So, like, they really approach it in an intelligent way in that regard, too. Like, they bring up, just how to calculate like the odds of pregnancy between different species. They talk about or even between two members of the same species. They talk about social consequences of sexually transmitted diseases. Not just like how to port in real life sexually transmitted diseases or what the medieval equivalents of them would be, but also like magical sexually transmitted diseases. There was a joke that's been around for years and probably came from this book originally, although I would bet it's probably still older than that, about how mummy rot is a sexually transmitted disease in D&D. And they have rules for it.
The old fallback of mummy rot.
But the funny thing, though, is that they also list lycanthropy and vampirism as sexually transmitted diseases, which kind of boggles my mind, and it's both logical and absurd at the same time. So it just... The idea of, okay, Bella, well, guess what?
Well, I did read a webcomic once where lycanthropy was transmitted sexually. So it's not an uncommon...
I mean, and I think that's been kind of an idea for a while. But I'm just imagining all the Twilight fans like suddenly having a new thing going on. Like, oh, okay, what does this mean?
Well, I mean, she still would have ended up as a vampire because, of course,
yeah,
I remember that scene, and they probably would have broken her instead of the bed.
A lot of the fan fiction would have gone differently, though.
Actually, no, wait, that was before she turned.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they had to turn her because she was dying because of the baby. Okay, I know too much about Twilight.
Anyway.
This is like taking your stereotypical horny bard that everyone seems to think is the only way you can play a bard, and basically being like, here's your bard guide.
You're not wrong. And they actually have a prestige class in here, and that's showing our age because most people that have only know D&D from 5th edition have no idea what a prestige class is. Just in case there's anybody listening that has overlap and doesn't know what we're talking about there, prestige classes were older edition things that kind of were specialized things. They were a little bit like the subclasses in 5th edition. But they actually have one called the Rake, where it's like, okay, a rogue may use seduction in order to get information or to distract somebody while they're stealing something. A bard may use seduction to, as part of their performance to kind of like make it little bit, more effective. The rake is someone like, no, I want, it's like sexual conquest, and I'm going to use this person to get in whatever, or maybe I'm just doing it to get my rocks off. And like, I realize like the horny bard archetype, that is the rake in here. And it's like, and of course the rake has all these bonuses, like, okay, well, you get a bonus to, or you remove penalties from trying to seduce people from other species that may not necessarily have the same kind of, find the same things attractive as your particular species, and you're able to overcome like a lot of the cultural barriers and all this other stuff. And it's like, that is kind of perfect for any game that wants to bring up any kind of bring up sex in a realistic way, at least as far as like, do the different cultures in somebody's homebrew world have different views on sex. And like, obviously there are going to be some societies that are open about sex. There are going to be some that like kind of push it to the wayside and like, no, we don't talk about this. And having kind of an idea like, okay, there are people that are trained to kind of like overcome these discrepancies and bridge the gap. And it's like, I'm sad this didn't catch on. Like, this was definitely an idea of genius before its time.
Well, it runs into the whole society making anything sexual taboo. It's like, unless you're having quiet missionary sex and not telling anybody about it, and only for procreation, then whatever sex you're having is wrong. And this book introduces, well, you can use sex to get what you want. You can use sex to make yourself a better performer. You can use sex to, like, if you do sex wrong, you can get these diseases and all these things nobody wanted to talk about for the longest, like my entire life at least. I know that much. And it's just, it was just like a little booklet of, here's all the things that your parents didn't want to talk to you about. So nobody knew what to do with it. And then you had some people that got a hold of it and were like, all right, cool, I'm going to make this work for my world. And then other people were like, sex. And then they just went nuts with it and turned it into a joke. So, I imagine it would probably be easier for it to catch on now if more people knew about it than when it was actually released.
Yeah, and one of the things that like really made me realize like this was so far ahead of its time was that it literally puts in, again, this is late 90s, early 2000s when this book came out. But anyway, what I was going at is that it has sections on kinks and fetishes, as well as the marriage and bonding and the difference between commitment and basically like the variations of commitment and infidelity. And it breaks down to something like that honestly a lot of people outside the kink community don't really understand. And it breaks it down as like the difference between a kink and a fetish is, a kink is something that just helps get you going. It doesn't mean you can't have regular, normal, boring, vanilla sex. It just means that, yeah, you got kinks that, kind of up the ante a little bit. Whereas a fetish is something that, like, okay, yeah, that's a little more complicated, because with a fetish, it's hard to get going without that particular fetish. And, that's something that needs to be talked about more. That's something that, that help people understand their own sexuality, and it doesn't talk about it in any kind of shameful language. Just like, this is just how certain people are. Some people are perfectly fine with normal sex, but they get a little bit extra aroused if you tie them up and spank them first. And then there are other people that are like, okay, yeah, they can engage in sex, but they have a serious leather fetish, and like, unless they're like, they or their partner have like some kind of leather gear on, it's really hard for them to maintain sex beyond a certain point or even get going sometimes. And it's always non-judgmental in all of the language. It's just like, this is just the way things are, the way people are different. And yeah, you got to discuss this with your partner and see like, what are they into, what are they not. Maybe you have to find a different partner if that's what comes down to. When they talk about commitment and marriage and all this other stuff, like, they go into how like, okay, they literally have a whole thing about how like, okay, is it one man with multiple wives? Is it one wife with multiple husbands? Is it a group marriage with like multiples of people of multiple different genders, is does your culture only allow marriage between, two people, or even more restrictive, two people of opposite genders? And they talk about how there's a difference between fidelity in your relationship and necessarily like being monogamous. Like they talk about like if a couple is, and this is the big thing because it gets to me of like, it is perfectly acceptable for there to be a couple that are romantically bonded with each other, but one person is asexual or demisexual, and the other person, may be a very sexual person. And if both of those people are perfectly okay with the sexual person going out and satisfying those needs outside of their relationship, as long as they are open and honest with their partner about everything that's going on, and the partner is okay, like there's nothing wrong with that, and they treat it as such, and they bring that up. It's like it really comes down to, they make consent the hard line on everything. It's like, as long as everyone involved is consenting, then there is nothing wrong with what is going on. And I love that. And that is like, again, I wish that this had like caught on back when this book was released, because think about how much different and how much farther along we would have gotten if this had caught on 20 years ago when this was first released.
Well, it's like, I'm in a lot of groups on Facebook, mostly to like promote this show and try to get guests and stuff. And just the way that so many people, like there are thousands of people in these groups, and they're so just accepting of everything. It's like, yeah, we practice ethical non-monogamy. Hey, you do you. That's awesome. I'm asexual. Right on. Power to you. I'm pansexual. You go. It's just, I need to find a way to get this out to more people, honestly. I may just start throwing it out in some of the groups that I'm in, but like, oh, hey, by the way, if any of you are nerds, here.
That's the thing, is that I've come across a few other, I say, like source materials like this that have been released since this. And the problem that I've come across is, like, if they're addressed maturely, then they pussyfoot around everything. They try to avoid really committing to anything or talking about anything outside of what is societally acceptable for open conversation. And the other side is, if they're willing to, if the ones that are willing to make those discussions, they treat everything as if it's a joke, and it comes across as, just a bunch of middle school boys having a laugh at the expense of anybody who has like weird, I say weird, in quotation marks, any kind of sexual preference or kink or anything. And it's just like, okay, dude, yeah, whatever, haha. And there's no seriousness about it. And that, I mean, obviously that's a problem. And it makes me kind of sad that, like, again, I keep coming back to this, that somebody 20 years ago made this basically a manual of, look, if you want to have more than just like G-rated D&D games, or, PG-13 because you got a whole lot of blood and violence, then this is how to do it. And like I said, everything recently either doesn't want to really have the hard conversations that need to be had, or they want to treat it as a joke.
It would have been nice to, get a chance to meet people who decided to come up with this and release it, because that would be a very interesting conversation. They would be amazing to have on the show. But it's just, they were so far ahead of their time, and they didn't even realize it. They thought they were just trying to help, and the world wasn't ready for it.
And at least it still exists in a digital form, because then it can be more easily spread. But they really, even as a world-building resource, it helps, because it talks about, like, of course, it talks about pregnancy and how well, like, certain species can interbreed with others, and, okay, can these two fantasy races make children, and are those, if they do, like, are those children themselves going to be able to have children, or are they just, automatically sterile because of genetic differences? But they also talk about the gestation periods and what this means for cross-species relationships. And like they talk about how, an elven pregnancy is obviously, because elves live so long, an elven pregnancy is going to be much longer than a human or any other race. Orcs tend to be shorter lived, even when you take their their rough, traditional culture out of the mix. Like, they're shorter lived than humans, and they mature much more quickly. So that means that their gestation period would probably be a lot shorter. And they talk about how, like, okay, well, both elves and orcs can interbreed with humans. So how does that change the gestation period and what the pregnancy is like for, like, a human mother of an with an orc, carrying the baby of an orc father, or an elven woman who is carrying the child of a human father? Like, how does that change the normal expectations? How does that change if you're going by older editions of how different races matured in different rates? Like, I know in 5th edition now, they basically say elves mature physically at the same rate as humans, and so on and so forth. But in older editions, no, it took an elf was basically not physically mature until they were close to 100 years old. So what does that mean for a half-elf? Like, clearly a half-elf is going to reach puberty and the sexual maturity far, far faster than any other elves. But that also means they're going to be severely delayed compared to humans. And what kind of societal issues does that cause? There's a lot of people out there with hormonal or genetic issues that cause that maybe they experience puberty a lot earlier, or their puberty was delayed until their condition was diagnosed and they were put on hormones to help actually stimulate puberty and get them going again. And, like, it's that sort of inclusion, by actually addressing this sort of thing, by bringing it up as a point of genetics and, like, actual, like, real life terms, it makes it so much more inclusive, not just to people of different sexualities, of different sexual orientations, but to people who have like, real life genetic issues that are outside of the human baseline. And it makes the intersex people have something that they can look into and actually find ways to make themselves in D&D without having to fit into the weird gender binaries that are going on.
Well, I do know that recently I heard of a potion of true self to help people who... I'm not even sure exactly what it is, but the way it was used in the reference that I heard was you use it to, like, adjust your gender or your whole identity to be who you really are and not just who you were born as.
Yeah, I first saw this when I had first gotten the Pathfinder 2nd edition source book, and I was just flipping through the pages and going through, just trying to browse through it to kind of give myself a basic familiarity of the terms and how things were set up. And I came across in their section on potions and alchemical items, I can't remember exactly how they phrased it, but it was basically a potion of, hey, it was expensive for, like, a D&D commoner, but it was fairly inexpensive as far as, like, in the overall cost of, like, all the magic items in the book. And it was just a potion that, hey, drink this if you're trans or intersex or whatever, and, like, let's say that you identify as this, but your body it reflects that, then drink the potion and suddenly it changes your body from that to this. So that way, whatever you feel that you are inside becomes also the outside. And yeah, it kind of is a magical hand waving of okay, well, we're just going to magically wipe away all of the issues that come with being a trans woman or a trans man or any kind of intersex. But in the same way, it's like, this is fantasy. And in a fantasy world, there would be ways to deal with these issues outside of all of the long, protracted process of hormone replacement therapy and surgery and all of these barriers that science hasn't come to figure out yet. Like, there's still no way at the moment for trans women to biologically carry a child within themselves. There's still no way for trans men at the moment to be able to biologically father a child in a traditional sense of fathering a child. And like, it makes sense that if this is a fantasy world and you're trying to create ways for people to be able to go from being one thing to become who they really want to be, then it makes sense that there should be things to strive toward. And I really like that. I mean, I've used the idea of this potion of true self I've brought it up in A Sundered World. I use it in my other D&D games that I run because I'm not going to question, like, if I make it a point not to bring up a player character's sexuality. Like, I never question a player on their character sexuality or whether they're trans, whether they're asexual, whatever. I will if they decide they want to try and seduce an NPC, then yeah, I might make a generic roll just to see, like, if they're open to being seduced by a character of that character's presentation. But beyond that, it's like, no, things are open. Characters will get hit on. If there's a NPC that's going to hit on people, then there are characters that'll hit on a PC regardless of, it's not going to, the character's sexuality isn't going to be brought up unless the character wants to take it beyond, okay, thanks for the compliment, but I'm not interested. That's once it goes beyond that point, then we'll go into a discussion of sexuality. Beyond that, it's just, okay, no, you're in a bar and there's somebody at the bar that's trying to flirt with you. Are you going to take it farther, or are you going to shut them down? I got kind of off track, and now I forgot what I was originally talking about, but, I do that. I think what I was going into was that, that whole, the true self thing, it shouldn't, a player's sexuality, orientation, that sort of thing, it shouldn't be an issue until the players decide to go in that direction, or if they've discussed it with the person running the game, that they want this to be part of the thing going on. And I know that, like, a lot of trans people probably don't want to revisit all of the bullshit that they have to deal with in real life when they're in their fantasy game. But the fact that the game has mechanics in that they are addressing it means that they are accepting it means that creators of the game are accepting that trans people exist, intersex people exist, and that there are struggles even within that world for these people to be who they really are. And they are acknowledging it, and they are trying to provide a way for those people, at least in this fantasy world, to facilitate becoming who they really are. And to me, that's inspiring, and I think I definitely can see where it's like, okay, it does seem kind of like a token gesture on one facet, but at least it's moving in the correct direction.
Well, recently, what happened with TSR recently? Yeah,
oh,
not going to go into the details, but if anybody knows, then you know. But with all that going on, the fact that the potion of true self is even a thing means that if not everybody, at least somebody in the higher up levels cares about being inclusive. And that's, at least something.
Yeah, and it sucks that a lot of these decisions are probably driven by capitalism, in that, there are these people higher up that are realizing, okay, this is the way the wind is blowing. we need to move in that direction or we're going to eventually collapse. It's a shame that that's probably the driving force behind it. But the fact that that means that they recognize that this is the way things are going means that eventually that will become the norm. And even within such a flawed society that we have, that means that yes, it is possible for us to move things in the right direction. It is possible for us to make change. It's frustrating that that change is not coming fast enough. It is frustrating that there are still people trying to undo that change that has already been made. But we know that it's possible. We know that it can be done. And we know that it is still, it has changed. It is still changing, and it is moving towards the better future. And that I will stand behind that basically as far as it'll go. I am all the way in support of things continuing to move in this direction. And as long as they're at least, making the effort, then I'm going to keep pushing it behind them.
Yeah, well, forward is always a good direction to go with these things, because when you start going backwards, then all you're going to see is where you were, and you're not going to go anywhere because all you care about is where you've been.
Yeah, and as we can see, there are going to be people we're going to look back and look at where we've been and how far we've come, and we're going to see people that were left behind because they decided they couldn't let go of certain things.
Yeah, well, from what I can tell, those people are quickly becoming vastly outnumbered. So I have hope for the way the future is going to turn out, at least in this regard, because we are legion, we are many.
And I'm glad that that our hobby is becoming more inclusive, because that's been the big thing that has bothered me ever since becoming nerdy and geeky has become more mainstream, and all of these hobbies like comics and superheroes and the tabletop games have all become so much more socially acceptable, and not just this like, oh, you're the weird nerd kid who doesn't have any friends, blah 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 blah. Like, suddenly that becoming more acceptable. Like, I get the knee-jerk reaction of those bullied nerdy kids to be like, okay, hold on, this was my safe space, and now suddenly these people who are making fun of me for it are now saying it's cool. I get that knee-jerk reaction. But, I also look at it as this is something that brought me comfort when things were down for me. And it allows me to escape from the awful things in my reality. And if that means... And the thing is, like, I want to share that with people that are also having a hard time. And that means recognizing that there are people who are outside of what society considers normal, having to deal with all of the pressures that come along with that. And if sharing my safe space with them to help them deal with their problems means that the tabletop RPG community needs to be more inclusive for people of different sexualities, of different orientations, various gender identities, all of this stuff, if that needs to be, if we have to become more inclusive in order for me to share it, then I'm going to do whatever I can to make it more inclusive. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you on this podcast about this book, because this thing helps bring that to the forefront. It helps not just... yes, it's okay to say that it's okay to have a trans character or a character in a wheelchair or this, that, or the other. That's great. But if there's always room to improve. There's always more to go on. And, there's, if you're going to tackle, real life situations in your tabletop games, then this is a way, this book, the Book of Erotic Fantasy, as much as the title seems silly, it is such a great resource for handling things regarding sexuality and orientation and gender in a mature way, and that way you can actually have resources it's a resource for anybody who may not necessarily understand certain things, to deal with it maturely, to, deal with those themes properly, to world build around those themes, and introduce them in a way that is inclusive and respectful and just accepting of everything different. And to me, that's what the whole point of these games are. It's like for you to explore things that you can't necessarily explore in real life, to be someone you can't be in real life, to be someone you are trying to be in real life. And you can't treat it as escapism if you don't actually provide the avenues to escape. And that's what's important to me.
Very profound. Well, I do got to say, of all the... you are one of the better DMs that I've played under, because while you are able to keep the game on track, I mean, yeah, we goof around and we laugh a lot on A Sundered World, but you're always able to get it back on track. But you give your players free reign to make the world theirs, be that, life choices or whatever, and there's no, this is the way this is, and you're not going to change it. And that's something you can, not every DM will do.
Well, I can, as I said, I'm fairly vanilla, but I've come to understand that being a good dungeon master in D&D is like being a good dungeon master in the kink community. Yeah, you gotta be able to have a firm hand and direct how things go, but ultimately, yeah, whatever control the Dom has is whatever control the sub allows them to have. And, yeah, you guys give me something, I'm gonna run with it. If this is what you want, this is how you want things to go, I'm going to push it as far as it'll go until you feel like you're uncomfortable with it or you're done with it and you want to try something else. Boom, I'm done. That's where we're going. And like that's metaphor and allegory is how I understand the world, and I figure if that helps me understand the kink community by looking it through the lens of my tabletop experience, that's great. That's how I'll try to explain it to other people. And honestly, like, I'll be honest, I can't listen to every episode of this podcast because there's a lot of subjects you cover that are like way outside my comfort zones. I'm like, okay, I'll get about 5-10 minutes in. I'm like, I can't listen to the rest of this. Good on to the rest of the people. This isn't my thing. There's times when, I recognize it's just me getting weirded out because you're going into a subject that, like, I probably could stand to know more about, but this isn't something I'm comfortable learning about at this time. It's triggering something. But, that's the great... But I appreciate the fact that you have made this podcast because it's a resource. There are episodes that I've recognized it, like, when I started listening to it, I'm like, okay, I'm not in the right headspace, or this isn't something I'm comfortable listening to right now. But this is something that I probably really need to know about. So I've kind of like bookmarked them and like, okay, next time I'm in a good headspace to kind of listen to this calmly and try to get through it, I need to go back and revisit these episodes and listen to them to get the information that I need to be more aware and understanding. And I really appreciate what you're doing with this podcast. And I really appreciate you having me on to talk about this, because this stuff is important. We're never going to get past all of these societal bullshit, societal mores that we have without talking about them and learning about them. And without resources like you, we're not going to be able to talk about them.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm just trying to, open the world up a little bit. It's like a lot of this is me learning for myself, but if I learn just for myself, then that's one person who knows it. If I can learn it and record it, then that's, anywhere from 50 to a couple 100,000 people who can get a chance to learn. So it just seemed like the right way to do it. So you wrote a book.
Yes.
And had it published and created a whole bunch of D&D stuff to keep working in it.
Yeah. My book is Unbalanced Scales. It's available on Amazon. You can also find like any of my short story work by searching for HCS Publishing or Hatton Cross Steampunk Publishing. I've contributed to pretty much all of their anthologies in one way or another. It's been an amazing experience being a writer, and honestly, like, being a writer has forced me to like really look into things like this and experience things outside my wheelhouse, because in order to make things real, I have to know what I'm talking about. And of course, anybody who's been on a Wikipedia binge know that you never stop at just that one article. There's always something else to click and like that you need more info on. Like the D&D content was just it was a natural thing. I already created this fantasy world. Why wouldn't I open that world up for other people to experience? And I'm glad that I've got you and the other cast members of A Sundered World to help flesh out the world of Bueth from my novel and the podcast, and add all these extra stories to it. And I'm glad that both you guys and the side plot lines for my podcast Patreon members, adding all these stories and fleshing things out and adding all of this color and variety to the world. It's amazing. And that's, you can't add that color and that variety and all that depth without also broaching the subject of, kink and fetish, because sex is going to be a part of the world no matter what you're doing. Love is going to be a part of the world no matter what you're doing. And you can't just say, oh no, this is what it is, and leave it at that. There's going to be varying shades and hues and all of these other things to make up that big, beautiful spectrum. And and that means that because it's a spectrum, there's going to be those things that are way over here in the corner that look indistinguishable from black and white, but in between there's all those different gradients. And it's got to be something more than just, the simple binary that we like to categorize things.
Okay, so your podcast, Sundered World, available most places you can find podcasts. There's a couple that I've looked for it and haven't been able to find it, but it's available most places. Real Play Dungeons and Dragons. I will make sure that I would get a hold of all of your links, and I will add all of those to the show notes, so anybody looking to follow his musings can do so. I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's good to have somebody, better versed in the role-playing community than I am talk about this, because I would be fumbling through it.
And, I mean, thanks a lot for letting me come on, because, letting me ramble for the better part of an hour of the various things. But, yeah, this stuff needs to be talked about. There's so much overlap between the communities. Yeah, I've talked about it in other media, but yeah, there's a lot of overlap between the role-playing community and the kink community, because, role-play happens in sex too. It's basically a hop, skip, and a jump. So, thanks for letting me be on, and thanks for the boost from your listeners, and I can't wait to see what else I can learn from your podcast in the future.
Well, if you have any suggestions for future topics, let me know. And if anybody else has any suggestions, let us know. I mean, get a hold of us on Twitter, LudiverseP, the email, ludiversepodcast@gmail.com. I'm easy to get a hold of. You can find me on Facebook. All the links are in the show notes. As always, I got to give a shout out to Zachary Hale, who financially supports the show. Another thank you to Hunter for being on, and if anybody else wants to be on the show, let me know. But until then, until next time, keep each other safe, have fun, and bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Ludiverse. If you have any questions or comments, contact us on Twitter or Facebook. Just search for the Ludiverse. Remember to rate and review wherever you listen, If you want to help support the show, please consider donating to our Patreon.